Hey everybody, it's Schaffrillas. I have a Redbubble now, so you can get, actually I had it for a year, but now I'm using it finally. Now you can get your very own That Was His Mistake shirt, or a mug, or this thing, pillow, or a sticker. Also, I have all these other designs and they're cool and you should buy them. Go to the Redbubble link in the description and you can buy things. Okay, video time. You know, if you had told me 5 years ago that I'd be obsessing over the life of Alexander Hamilton, sobbing over the myth of Orpheus, or being thoroughly invested in the 70-page snippet of War and Peace while not being interested in any other portion of the book whatsoever, I'd probably give you a hearty, yeah, right, like that's ever gonna happen. What a load of flush, somebody. But you know what? Those all happened. All because of you. Musical theater is a pathway to many interests some considered to be unnatural. Musicals tell the impossible. I mean, really think about it. The best way to get someone into something is to combine it with another thing that already interests them. I mean, take my buddy Tierzu, for example. Teaching zoology by using gaming terminology is such a brilliant, effective concept. So now you know all about animals and it doesn't even feel like you were being taught to. Amazing. Hell, my Frollo video was kind of just an excuse to get some of y'all thinking about musical theater by directly comparing it with a Disney movie you're familiar with. I figured it's the easiest way to pique your interest in the medium. Today's video, however, is kind of the inverse. We're gonna take a look at some recent musicals that do something really weird and unexpected with the source material they're adapting. Aside from, you know, the simple act of making them into a musical. Anything can be a musical. You take a movie, you slap some traditional Broadway songs onto it, bada bing, musical. But these shows go the extra step beyond. They implement some sort of unique style or voice that makes them a far cry from the Broadway adaptations of old. Or, well, the works that they're adapting for that matter. So why are these shows being made? And more importantly, why are they working? Let's find out. First of all, it's important to note that weird musical adaptations are not a new phenomenon. Take Jesus Christ Superstar, for example. I don't think rock opera and contemporary are the first things that come to mind when you read this, but ultimately, Andrew Lloyd Webber realized that they were the perfect ways to adapt a story that, at its core, is about relationships and betrayal. The story of Jesus and Judas probably doesn't hold a lot of water or wine to a non-religious person, but if you strip away the myth from the man and simply look at it as a tragedy about a broken friendship, it's really compelling. Probably the best arc in the entire Bible, up there with Noah's. See, I'm personally religious, but I love that this musical is inherently not. It lets anyone, regardless of faith, get invested in the story. But that's not even getting into the wacky side of this musical. The best thing about JCS is how versatile the setting and tone can be, while still allowing the story to work. The message is that Jesus' story is timeless, and you can tell it in any way imaginable. You want tanks rolling through the desert towards Judas? You got him. You want the priests to have these weird, futuristic, triangular wizard cloaks? Go for it. You want King Herod's song to be a live celebrity roast? That's basically what it is, so sure. Or you could do this. I don't need your blood money. Oh, that doesn't matter. Our expenses are good. Bottom line is, the story is so versatile that you can have any setting, costumes, sets, etc., and it'll still work. That's honestly remarkable. I really wish more musicals were like this, but they rarely are, especially adaptations. Take a look at Les Mis or Phantom. Now, I love Les Mis with all my heart, and I tolerate Phantom relatively decently, but these are a far cry from the loose interpretations present in Jesus Christ Superstar. No one would ever say, hey, let's set Les Mis in space and make it a metaphor for the oppression of the Rebel Alliance against the cold, uncaring threat of the Empire. Boy, oh boy, I can't wait for Javert, a Star Wars story where we find out where he got his stupid hat from. To quote Skipper from the 2005 DreamWorks animated sensation Madagascar, that ain't gonna fly. These musicals are very much products of the time periods they take place in. The emotions are still felt when you see the plight of Valjean, Eponine, Enjolras, and so on, mostly because the music is phenomenal, but it's also very traditional Broadway. It's bombastic, it's triumphant, it's serious, it's tragic. It's exactly what you'd expect from a musical adaptation of this beloved French novel. It doesn't leave much to the imagination, however. I think it's safe to say that everything in Les Mis plays out the way you would expect it to if you're familiar with the story. Now, it's amazing. I love it. It works super well. Don't get me wrong. It's just not the most daring adaptation out there, and a lot of other musical adaptations are kinda similar. Look no further than the other musicals made by the same guys who made Les Mis, whose names I will not attempt to pronounce. They made Miss Saigon, an adaptation of the opera Madame Butterfly. This show isn't as acclaimed as Les Mis, especially nowadays, but the original run was still massively successful. And then they made this hot garbage. Yeah, remember the Pirate Queen? Of course you don't. It closed after 85 performances, got a whopping 0 Tony nominations, and lost its producers at least $16 million. Yikes. Ben Brantley, in a New York Times review, wrote that the show compares unfavorably with the composer's Les Miserables, and that it registers as a relic of a long-gone era. Oh really? This musical came out in 2007, long after Broadway saw more unconventional and acclaimed adaptations like Rent, which at the time took the Broadway community by storm. The tides had certainly been shifting away from bombastic, traditional-sounding musicals for quite a while, and encouraging more bizarre productions. I mean, remember when Avenue Q beat Wicked for Best Book, Best Score, and Best Musical? Like, huh?
Nobody is ever gonna break.
I'm not a huge fan of either show, but I think I agree with all three of those, to be honest. But yeah, Broadway has been inching towards weirdness for quite some time, with unique subject matter, unexpected musical styles for a Broadway production, and increasingly less traditional stories. And since theater is such a collaborative medium, I figured I'd bring in fellow YouTuber slash former theater kid Sarah Z. Or is it Sarah Z? I'm American, so this letter is an enigma to me. Anyway, I brought her in to further discuss the incredible appeal of musicals.
Hi James, it's me, Sarah Zed. It's cool, I don't know how to pronounce your name either. I make analytical videos about weird cultural phenomena as well as pop culture, and I'm a huge theater nerd. James has talked about some really amazing Broadway musicals like Jesus Christ Superstar with some pretty weird sounding concepts on paper, but whose weirdness have paid off in the medium of theater. This is for a variety of reasons, and it's partly because theater really allows its audience to suspend disbelief in a way that live action film or TV might not allow for. Lots of musical concepts sound profoundly silly on paper, like a bunch of humanoid cats singing rock songs about which one of them gets to die. When these things are presented as hyper-realistic events that are physically taking place in our world, they often just don't work. The trailer for the film version of Cats ended up turning its audience off because of a mix of really bad CGI and the fact that forcing us to picture singing humanoid cats as an aspect of our own physical world is jarring and uncomfortable. But theater doesn't necessarily need to conform to the constraints of our own physical world. Instead, the stage can be stylized in such a way as to pull us into another world. Take The Lion King, the highest grossing musical of all time. The Lion King's costuming uses a combination of puppetry, mask work, and body paint to create an immersive experience that pulls us into its world. They don't need to literally look like real lions or warthogs to be appealing to an audience. Instead, the medium of theater can create an alternative stylized world that's separate from our own. Unlike, say, the CGI Lion King remake, where the animals couldn't emote in exaggerated and compelling ways for fear that this wouldn't appear realistic in our world, the stage can make these bold, creative choices that may not be hyper-realistic, but can allow an audience to use its imagination and suspend its disbelief. In this way, it's similar to animation, where suspension of disbelief can be easier than in live action since its primary goal isn't to create something that can be realistically integrated into our own world. But another dimension of musicals that, while not unique to Broadway shows, is certainly their signature is the musical number. The use of music in a lot of Broadway shows is also an essential component of making weird or silly concepts into something great. It's a common response in a lot of people who don't like Broadway to complain about the existence of songs. If you've talked about musicals with people, you've probably either said or heard at some point something like, "It makes no sense. It's like people are standing around talking and then all of a sudden they start singing? I hate it." Certainly, musicals aren't everyone's cup of tea. But an advantage of musical numbers, at least in a good show, is their ability to communicate information about the world in a unique and recognizable way. One old saying in the theater world is, "You sing when you can no longer speak." Take the song Requiem from the massively popular Dear Evan Hansen. The singer, a character named Zoe Murphy, is reconciling with her feelings about her brother Connor after he recently took his own life. He treated her horribly, and although she feels pressured to grieve in the traditional way, she can't bring herself to feel broken about his death. The song then cuts to the other family members, all physically alone but singing together as they each struggle to reconcile with Connor's death in their own ways. Certainly, this information could have been communicated to an audience through each character simply standing on stage and talking out loud about their feelings, but the use of song is effective. The characters all singing the same melody and same line, even as they refuse to speak to one another, really highlights this same process of grief that they're all experiencing, while still emphasizing how divided they all feel. None of the family members are yet ready to speak with one another about what happened, but the audience can still understand everyone's perspective through song.
The emotional complexity musicals can add to an already great story is really something to behold. 2015's Fun Home is a favorite of mine. It's all about a lesbian cartoonist coming to grips with her sexuality as well as her father's suicide. It fits the medium of musical theater really well. However, it doesn't really stand out as an inventive or unconventional adaptation, just a really great traditional one. It's not a super talked about or obsessed over musical, even despite the relative scarcity of LGBT+ stories on Broadway. But then there was this other musical that came out in 2015. You may have heard of it. It's based on the American Revolution. Jeez, you kids need to learn your history. So yeah, this musical called Hamilton came out and took the world by storm. Even if you don't like musicals, you know about this show. It changed everything and made musicals and American history more accessible to everyone. Why? Because it's weird. There was this musical called 1776 that nobody talks about, probably because it's a by-the-numbers adaptation of historical events that don't interest a ton of people. But Hamilton is a hip-hop retelling of the life and times of a really compelling historical figure who met a dramatic end at the hands of a former friend. That's a really compelling story buried underneath the huge barrier to entry that is American history. Sound familiar? People have called Hamilton the next Phantom or the next Rent, but it honestly shares the most DNA with Jesus Christ Superstar, right down to the whole villain being the narrator concept. Lin knew that deep down, in the middle of this grand narrative, was an immensely human, personal story. Instead of crafting some masterful dramatic work, the best way to connect with this story to people would be by making it stand out from the crowd. Much like how connecting JCS to prison riots, cults, social media, etc. can actually enhance the message of its story by making it more relatable and interesting, so too has Hamilton found massive success by connecting its young, scrappy, and hungry characters to the kind of music young, scrappy, and hungry people would listen to. Unconventionality for the sake of unconventionality isn't enough. It's finding these inherent connections that most people wouldn't even dream of, even though they really do make sense when you think about it. Also, my editor Jaleesa has something to add, so let's hear it.
The literary term for this is defamiliarization. It means taking the familiar and looking at it in a new way so that it becomes unfamiliar. So your show might have well-known figures like George Washington or Jesus, or to use a really recent example, the 6 Wives of Henry VIII. But you take away the caricaturization and the trappings of that time period, and instead focus on the side that people don't know and connections they wouldn't have considered. That approach to storytelling can yield a lot of creativity, even when it's applied to a quote-unquote story that you think you've heard before. But anyway, back to Hamilton.
So now everybody respects this guy, finally. People are reading more about him and his life, and museums and historians are certainly starting to take notice. This is the power of a great adaptation. It gets people invested in the source material even if they didn't expect to have any interest in it. Hamilton also managed to stay relevant due to the Hamil Drops, a collection of officially licensed covers that reimagine the musical songs in a variety of styles. I personally think they peaked with First Burn, and the only one that even came close was the one where they literally got Barack Obama to read Washington's farewell. But regardless, hearing these musicals redone in all sorts of unique genres was so novel. It really speaks to how versatile theater is as an ever-evolving art form compared to any other storytelling medium.
One more thing that I think makes musicals uniquely cool is how they can evolve over time. Unlike, say, a podcast or a show where one episode is recorded and then that's finished, when a musical plays somewhere, the same show has to be recreated over and over again, sometimes thousands of times, and most of those recreations will cease to exist after the night is over. This isn't always the case, as sometimes performances are recorded, but the nature of musicals as something that must be performed and recreated constantly in order for it to continue to exist puts musicals in a unique position for them to evolve and change. In some instances, this means introducing an element of improv or unpredictability. So, for example, one of my favorite, slightly less mainstream musicals is called the 25th Annual Putnam County Spelling Bee, and it's about 6 kids at a spelling bee. Over the course of the show, we learn more about each kid and the various circumstances in life that brought them there. When the show was playing on Broadway, they would bring 3 or 4 audience members on stage to fill the positions of early eliminated bonus spellers. The audience members provided an opportunity for small, sometimes unpredictable improvised moments to appear. For instance, the announcer character would be tasked with making up funny anecdotes about the guest spellers based on their name, occupation, or clothing. These were sometimes small moments, but they nevertheless guaranteed that you would get a slightly different show each time you went to see it.
Now that I think about it, I can confirm this. I was one of the guest spellers at Spelling Bee when my college performed it, and the improv comment they made was something like, "James enjoys intimidating people with his luscious sideburns," which, like, I guess I can't really argue with that. Either way, it was a really fun improvised moment.
On one instance, Carrie Close, who won the actual real-life National Spelling Bee in 2006, was invited on stage as a guest speller. I was in this show in high school, and at a certain point, you're supposed to introduce incrementally harder spelling words to get the audience members eliminated and off stage after, say, 3 or 4 rounds with them. Carrie Close lasted 14 rounds. Instances like this, where the actors are required to improvise to create interesting moments while keeping the show on track, certainly aren't a thing in every Broadway show. If you tried to improvise in Phantom or Wicked, it would not be well received. But Broadway as a medium is still uniquely permissive of certain shows being mutable in this way, and it's a potential that makes musicals really cool.
Going back to Hamilton, this show took over my life in a major way back when it first came out. I was known as the Hamilton guy back then. The person who got everyone else in our school musicals hooked on it, and the one to talk to about any Ham opinions. Look no further than the 18 Hamilton AMVs I released on this very channel, which in themselves are great examples of the unexpected connections I made between founding fathers and other random works of fiction. I connected the Hamilton bird duel to the end of Fire Emblem Fates. I connected King George's oppression to Emperor Palpatine's. I mashed Right Hand Man up with my very own high school production of Pippin. Look it, I played Charlemagne. There I am, Gary, there I am. And perhaps my greatest life accomplishment, molding the plight of a young, scrappy, and hungry Alexander Hamilton with that of Barry B. Benson from B-Movie. These weird as hell AMVs work because there's already a level of unconventionality to the way these historical figures are being presented. But since their plight and emotions are being brought to life in a musically interesting way, it's easy to connect that music to other characters who could potentially be singing a very similar song. Also, Lin-Manuel recommended the Star Wars mashup I made on Twitter. It was a long time ago, I don't really have proof of it anymore, but he did it, and it was the greatest day of my life, pretty much. But yeah, I became obsessed with this show and its cast. So much so that I sought out any other projects and musicals they worked on. What's that? Pippa Sue appeared in this weird, obscure off-Broadway musical? Well, okay, I'll give it a shot, I guess. Great Comet is the king of weird Broadway adaptations. Dave Malloy took a look at this massive classic novel, War and Peace, and said, hey, you know, there's a really interesting 70-page chunk buried in here. Let me take that out and turn it into an electro-pop opera. Why not? Malloy is fully aware of how daunting the source material is and how uninterested general audiences probably are in it. That's why the musical is very tongue-in-cheek, letting you know in the first song that it's a complicated Russian novel where every character has 9 different names. So feel free to check your program to keep track of everyone. That's hilarious. But the weird part is the way the music itself is actually structured. There's not really choruses or patterns to many of the songs. It's more like a stream of consciousness that just kind of flows from one style or tempo to the next. It works really well to heighten dramatic confrontations between characters, or even just show their contrasting personalities in regular conversations. The show, of course, has some traditionally structured ballads for its leads to sing, and they're fantastic. But the daring approach to how most of the music plays out is what really gives this show its emotional weight and appeal. That and the loosely established setting. This is a very contemporary feeling show, despite explicitly letting you know that it takes place in 19th century Russia. The modern sound and rave atmosphere during the party scenes really sucks you into the frivolity of these Russian aristocrats and manages to separate it from that particular setting. Since this musical is very recent, it obviously doesn't have a ton of adaptations yet, but I feel like it has plenty of potential to go the Jesus Christ Superstar route and have its setting reinterpreted in all sorts of ways. And the way it was staged is astonishing. Everybody bowed down to Rachel Chavkin because she might be the most talented stage director working right now. The musical started out off-Broadway, being staged around dinner tables. The actors simply performed around the audience, making for a ridiculously immersive experience. Obviously, you can't do that in a Broadway theater, which is why they completely redesigned the entire stage area. Put a couple dinner tables on the stage so a few audience members could still experience things the way they were intended, and created the most inventive lighting and blocking I've ever seen on stage anywhere. The show ended up critically acclaimed, receiving 12 nominations at the Tonys, but only winning 2 for lighting and scenic design. I will never understand how it lost direction and orchestrations, but whatevs.
Tell me, where is the justice?
The show then closed a few months after the Tonys upon the departure of its main star, Josh Groban, and a casting controversy that's a subject for another day. I always kinda got the impression that Great Comet would never really work on Broadway. It always felt like such a niche concept for a musical, and not in the same way as Hamilton, which at least adapted familiar historical figures using a very popular form of music. Everything about Great Comet was so out there, from the concept to the staging to the music. I always thought Josh Groban wasn't a good fit for Pierre, and it felt more like a way to sell the show to a general audience. And once he left, yeah, it turns out general audiences didn't consider the show their cup of tea. But with that said, this might be the biggest cult classic musical of the decade. I've talked with so many people who say this is one of their all-time favorites, and I'm so happy about that. Hearing that it clicked with others due to its inventive look and daring sound is just such a great feeling. Also, side note, Dave Malloy saw my Great Comet Nightmare Before Christmas AMV, and I have proof this time.
Yeah, and the other thing I should mention, this is a fun thing for you to go home and YouTube later, if it's still up. But someone did actually make an amazing mashup of Jack Skellington's like final aria that he sings in the graveyard with Dust and Ashes. So it's like Josh singing Dust and Ashes with like that footage, and it's incredible. So whoever made that, God bless you. I hope it wasn't taken down yet for copyright reasons.
Don't worry, Dave, my boy, it's right here. Thank you so much. Please never stop making musicals. But yeah, I wasn't too upset about the Tonys, because I knew that Dave and Rachel Chavkin would get their well-deserved Tony sooner or later. Wow, that was fast. Now we get to Hadestown, the brainchild of singer-songwriter Anais Mitchell.
Who?
Anais Mitchell.
That's not my name.
She and Rachel Chavkin both won Tonys for this show, plus it picked up Best Musical, Featured Actor for Andre de Shields, and a couple other prizes. Longtime Schaffrillas fans may recognize the guy who plays Hades as the T-posing Frollo from the musical adaptation of Hunchback I talked about in my video. Is there anything Patrick Page can't do? Honestly. Hadestown is yet another weird adaptation to shake things up on Broadway and reinterpret a classic story in an engaging way. It started life as a concept album based on the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, a sort of folk opera that takes place in the Great Depression era inspired post-apocalyptic setting. That's not exactly what I would expect when looking at this story, but it fits the tone so well. It's a time of hardship where Eurydice is tempted by the illustrious prosperity of Hadestown. Yeah, in a depression apocalypse, I can understand that. The music is decidedly more conventional than Great Comet, but it mixes quite a few styles together and definitely feels unique compared to the typical musical. This isn't a show of togas and traditional Greek-sounding ballads. It's about oppressed coal miners working for the king of an electric city. It's so neat and unexpected conceptually, and it allows us to really get wrapped up in the emotions and the tragedy of this story. The ending to this show hits me hard every time I listen to it, and I don't think a straight, conventional adaptation will be able to pull that off.
When it comes to weird musicals like Hadestown, the music is critical. Take a song like Why We Build the Wall. It takes place in the underground factory of Hades, who in this adaptation is a power-hungry factory owner, as he reminds his mistreated workers of the necessity of the wall they're building. In actuality, it's mindless and pointless work, but the belief that they're keeping themselves safe and fed keeps them complacent. In case you were wondering, the song was written in 2010.
Because we have and they have not. My children, because they want what we have got.
Because we have and they have not, because they want what we have got.
The musical structure of Why We Build the Wall is what really makes it work. The repetitive melody adds to the circular logic of the task, and the call and response format of it highlights how effectively Hades has manipulated his workers into complacency. If the concept of an ancient Greek folk opera sounded weird, the effectiveness of its music really drives and sells it. All in all, I think these are the three main reasons as to why Broadway musicals are a uniquely effective medium for so-called weird concepts or shows. The way great music can be used to emphasize or sell things that may have fallen flat without songs, and the way the stage can be stylized to let an audience suspend its disbelief, can mean that ideas that may not have translated well to, say, film or TV can really thrive. Finally, the fact that they're performed every night means, for many shows, it's okay if two performances aren't exactly the same because there's no final take. No one performance is the end-all be-all of that show. Rather, it's a living organism. Even something as small as the Book of Mormon editing a few of its jokes to keep them current is something you don't get out of many mediums, and it's something that I really appreciate about Broadway. Overall, I love musicals, and I think broadly speaking, their weirdness is what makes them great. I can't wait to see what Broadway will come up with next.
The popularity of shows like Hamilton, Great Comet, and Hadestown, which push the boundaries of what an adaptation can accomplish, are indications that we should allow auteurs to tell the amazing stories they want to tell on Broadway, no matter how weird they may seem. A lot of people complain about the endless and kinda soulless film adaptations cluttering up Broadway stages. I know I love to complain about one of them in particular. And yeah, many of these are just kinda cash grabs. Sometimes you get a rare gem, but for the most part, they just exist because popular movie plus conventional Broadway songs equals bank. There's nothing novel about the way these properties are being adapted. But an unconventional adaptation can get you invested in something you never expected to be invested in, because it can connect with you via something else you understand or are invested in. There are amazing stories out there that can work in all sorts of mediums. It just takes an exceptional mind to bring them out. Did you know that out of all the Tony Award for Best Musical winners, there have only been 4 that had their books, music, and lyrics written by a single person? The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Rent, Hamilton, and Hadestown. There's only been a handful of nominees with that distinction, most notably Oliver, which I hate. But aside from Hamilton and Hadestown, the only nominated musical this century with that distinction is Great Comet. Musicals are hard to write completely on your own. Collaborations can yield excellent results and make for some iconic productions. But there is something so inspiring about one person taking a look at a myth, a person's life, or a tiny sliver of a large story and saying, I love this. Now how can I get other people to love it? The creativity that can be spawned from simply asking oneself that question is truly awe-inspiring. So kudos to the Lin-Manuels and Dave Malloys and Anais Mitchells and Rachel Chavkins of the world for taking a look at classic stories not many people care about these days and seeing them not the way they are, but the way they could be.